Well, thank you. This morning, I read a news report of Michelle Obama's visit to China. And it reads, and I quote here, "In China yesterday, Michelle Obama told a crowd of about 200 students, most of whom were from the United States, it is so important for information and ideas to flow freely over the internet and through the media. My husband and I are on the receiving end of plenty of questioning and criticism from our media and our fellow citizens. And it's not always easy. But I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world." She added, "When it comes to expressing yourself freely and worshiping as you choose and having open access to information, we believe those are universal rights that are the birthright of every person on this planet." Now, the First Lady's comments call our attention to the convergence of three important things in American history. First, we have the internet, which was undoubtedly created by the United States government, but remained virtually worthless. I use the word virtue in both senses. Virtually worthless until American entrepreneurs took hold of it using Tim Berners-Lee's protocol and created the World Wide Web. Second, Obama praises universal human rights. And those of you not from Mississippi, that's R-I-G-H-T-S. While certainly not an American invention, the notion of rights that are both human, as opposed to, say, English rights, or municipal rights, but human rights, reflect a major shift in the way Americans came to think of rights and illustrate an important lesson I hope we're going to learn later today, this morning. Finally, Obama claims these rights are universal and should be held by everyone, which I think is a bit of a sleight of hand, and one that I'll show at the end of this presentation why there should be growing concern. Each of these things points, I believe, to an equally important characteristic of how American intellectuals and politicians confront the federal nature of American society and capitalism. One shows the importance of America's decentralized spheres of social existence. Another highlights a shift in how American intellectuals came to define human worth and dignity at the turn of the 20th century. And finally, the last of those things, universal human rights, the universality of it, tells us something about how these same intellectuals work and continue to work to challenge the inherent federalism of American life. And what I would like to do is begin with a very positive note, and that is to describe how the federal nature of American society at the end of the 19th and early 20th century did so much to raise standards of living in this country. Then I'll talk about those other two things in due time. One thing to keep in mind about late 19th century America is that it is distinct from Europe's history with the Industrial Revolution. I think it can be argued, as many economists seem to agree now, that standards of living in Europe likely declined from 1860 to roughly 1880, at least with that first generation that industrialized, in terms of their living conditions, in terms of the relationships they had, in terms of nutritional value, the food they ate. There probably was a slight decline. Now, had there not been a potato famine that swept through Europe, a lot of these people would not have gone to factories to begin with, so they would have been eating plenty of potatoes, and their nutritional intake would have been fairly high. But history is what it is. That may not have been the case with the United States. There is a decline in standards of living in the United States from 1860 to 1880, But that is not a result of industrialization. It's a result of the American Civil War. Most Americans suffered during the war, not just Southerners, but also Northerners as well. Coffee imports, for example, which we have been enjoying this morning. It took almost a decade for coffee imports to return to the level they were in 1860, right before the war began. Keep in mind, for you, those of you who are economics students, coffee is one of the greatest measures of American standard of living. We consume more coffee than the rest of the world combined. We've always consumed lots of coffee, and we can't grow coffee here. We have to import it. So per capita imports of coffee are really a good measure of standard of living. If those imports are going down per capita, then you can reasonably say something's happening. May not be really bad, but something's going on here. Coffee imports are going up per capita, and but barring no other major change, like the creation of a Starbucks chain or something along those lines nationwide, then American standard of living is probably going up. Those of us old enough to remember before there were coffee houses and coffee chains can understand how that figure is so important. Once you get Starbucks and it becomes fashionable, the statistics maybe can be thrown out the window at that point, but nonetheless. The American Civil War interrupts this. The kind of economic growth the country began to experience by the middle of the 1840s is interrupted. You have a lost generation of economic growth and productivity from 1860 to roughly 1880. You have widespread losses due to deaths on the battlefield and deaths due to disease. I threw out a lot of statistics last night, but it's estimated somewhere around $1 billion in 1860 terms was lost due to the lifelong income value of people killed on the battlefields. To this day, we still do not know how many slaves and freedmen died during the Civil War. Estimates are now as many as almost as 20 to 25% of the black population died due to the problems of disease, the breakdown of the plantation system, widespread famine and starvation, murder, political violence. Both Confederate and Northern forces were prone to execute blacks for the least thing during the war. It's a terrible thing. That's the basic lesson here to learn. But by 1879 forward, the American economy recovered. 1879, we go back to a true gold standard. The kind of federal nature of American society returned. I'll say more about that here in just a moment. And so the United States enters what is arguably the longest period of sustained growth in our history, 1880 to the early 1900s. This increase in standard of living is in terms of real salaries, real incomes. It's in terms of innovations that improve people's lives. It's in terms of life expectancy. Virtually every measure that you want to go up went up after 1880. Virtually every measure you want to go down went down after 1880 and continued for a generation. The formal cause of this, we can put it in Aristotelian terms, the formal cause was the spread of the factory system. It was sort of industrialization. But industrialization did not touch every aspect of American society. Industrialization came late to the South. It really doesn't come to the American South until after sort of during World War II and really into the 1940s and 50s. It doesn't really come to the American West until the 1930s, the 1940s, and it doesn't come to the Mountain West until a later period of time as well. But nonetheless, that factory system is going to spread. The underlying cause, however, of this expansion of American standard of living was the decentralized nature of American society. These concurrent, parallel societies, limited in their reach, but no less competing for attention and allegiance of individual Americans. America at the end of the 19th century was not a society of autonomous individuals. And I think that's important for if we had a way of drawing a diagram of this. It would not be a single individual, a single stick figure at the top of a pyramid. It was not individualism in that sense. Rather, a better drawing or image of this kind of life would be a circle, an individual, a little small one-person stick figure in the middle, but that person surrounded by countless overlapping spheres of activities. All of these spheres of activities make demands on that individual. So there's a complex web of rights, of responsibilities, of freedoms, of duties, all involving Americans by the end of the century. The Civil War interrupted this, but it's important to understand even the Civil War did not destroy this. And I'll speak more about the importance of not being able to destroy that social fabric later in this presentation. Because you see, what this shows is the firm entrenchment of federalism, not political federalism, separation of powers and that sort of thing, but of federalism in American society. It simply could not be taken away. Now, this may not be exclusively an American way of living, but it is no less a distinctive feature of American life, and perhaps even something that gives, may lend itself to being an exceptional feature of American life, if we can venture in that direction. Those of you not from the United States, not raised in the United States, you may have a similar social condition in the country in which you were born, but maybe not nearly as intense as it is here in the United States. As I like to tell groups of students, when you wake up every morning, you have to decide who and what is going to command your allegiance. Will it be your parents? Will it be your cell phone? Will it be a significant other? Will it be your instructors? Will it be your friends? Will it be the friends in the other building? Will it be Walmart? Will it be Kmart? Do y'all have Kmart around here?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Will it be Starbucks? Will it be McDonald's? Will you wear blue jeans? Will it be Levi's? Is Levi's still around?
Mm-hmm.
Will it be Levi's? Will it be a sweatshirt manufacturer? Will you wear a Cardinals sweatshirt today? Or will you wear an Atlanta Braves sweatshirt, which you ought to wear? In other parts of the world, we're beginning to see these kinds of things emerge. But those things were not common at the turn of the 20th century. They were becoming common in the United States. That, I think, is exceptional. That is a product of the federal nature of that society, and all these different spheres competing to make claims on individuals. And I've only talked about it in economic terms. I haven't talked about it in religious terms or emotional terms, which I might say something about here in a moment. What we then see coming out of this sort of decentralized society is the rapid expansion at the end of the 19th century of devices and new kinds of associations that facilitated the exchange of wealth, information, and productivity across the lines of those parallel associations and spheres of life. Now let me give some examples of this, and I want to repeat something I told you yesterday. The United States does not so much undergo an industrial revolution as it undergoes a communication revolution. And I think it's not even so much a revolution as it was a rapid expansion of developing new ways of communicating with each other. That really is what occurs at the end of the 19th century. The United States does not invent the factory system, for example. We do not invent the gadgets in the textile industry that were so important in industrialization in Great Britain. We do not invent mining improvements that were developed in Wales and other coal mining regions of Great Britain that produced the steam engine. We do not invent carts and rails and even locomotives which were used to bring coal out of those mines at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But we do invent ways of speeding that activity up. We do invent ways of distributing the products of those kinds of efforts across vast distances and across different groups of people. Let me just kind of mention a few of these. I think this is really fun talking about it. The United States does not invent the shopping mall. The first shopping mall is in northern Italy. I think it was in Milan in the 1890s. It's my understanding that shopping mall is still in existence today. I've never been there. I've been to Florence, but I've never been to Milan to see that. But the United States makes the shopping mall a fundamental feature in American life. No other country does this. It is the United States and American manufacturers that invent branding and brand names. And the reason why those things developed at the end of the 19th century was so that manufacturers could differentiate themselves. And notice this, I'm using the word differentiate. I could use another word. I could say it was a way manufacturers could decentralize themselves from each other and better compete for people's attention in the American marketplace. So we create a brand item that is associated with quality, that is associated with trust, that is associated with a willingness to exchange. So quality, trust, and exchange. These are virtuous activities. These are not examples of corruption. These are not examples of capitalism's greed or examples of capitalism's inability to foster, or really, I guess just to say, examples of capitalism's ability to foster vice. Rather, it's an example of capitalism's ability to foster virtue. So manufacturers create these brand names to get people's attention. And so we start buying Levi's jeans. Or we start buying products from Sears. We may not do that today, but... Or we start buying products from a particular seller like Mr. Kroger or Mr. Kress, who then go on and buy and create grocery stores, or Kress's, which eventually became Kmart. So branding is a good example of this. Branding is a product of a decentralized society. Department stores are a product of decentralized society. And Americans probably should be given credit for inventing department stores. I mean, in effect, you go into a department store and it's decentralized. There are departments there. There's a men's department, there's a women's department, there's a shoe department, there's a jewelry department, there's makeup department, there's a kitchen department. All of these things were created to try and target a specific aspect of a person's life. What's going to command my allegiance today? My feet. So I go into the department store and I buy shoes. But I'm identifying with the brand name of that department store. And so when I need something to make me smell better, I go to that department store and I purchase cologne or perfume. I guess I would wear cologne. I guess. Thank you. If I need something for my wife to smell better, I'll go get perfume. But anyway. So notice the very structure of American department stores were a reflection of the kind of society that Americans were living in. And almost all of these department stores began as local enterprises. And there are very few examples of businesses in the United States prior to 1950 that did not begin as some local business. And as they grew in popularity, as they improved their production cycles, as they improved their distribution networks, those things that were once local rise to the occasion. They become regional, and then if they're really good, they become national. So it's not an example of something imposed or planned and poured in from the top. It's something that grows up spontaneously from the bottom outward. Some other things that Americans develop in response to this decentralized way in which they live was modern advertising. Now, those of you who are economics students, you probably already know this, and I think this is still widely accepted within the profession. Correct me if that's not the case. Modern advertising is a way of keeping customers more than it is a way of getting new customers. It's a way of making sure the customers you already have are going to be happy with the products that they are already accustomed to getting. So it's in some ways, it reaffirms a habit, a tradition in which people are living their lives. So I may not be thirsty for a Coca-Cola right now, but I like that beverage, and if I see an advertisement for that beverage and it's some nice, curvy bottle and something, something else, I may like putting in a curvy bottle here, and it's got a little bit of dew on the side, and maybe a little piece of ice rolling down on the edge. It causes me to want to drink that Coca-Cola. But if I see a Pepsi doing the same thing, I don't care. Because I have identified myself as a Coca-Cola man. In fact, in Mississippi, we called it Coca-Cola, not Coca-Cola. It is also the case, even my children still do this, all carbonated beverages are called Cokes. It could be orange, and it's still called, it's an orange Coke, okay. It's not something that wouldn't be just a soda or something. So modern advertising is a way in which Americans develop techniques of communicating across these parallel associations and trying to solidify those connections. New political activities also developed at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century to try and foster a sense of identity. Again, as organizations are trying to command people's total allegiance. So the development of blue states and red states came about in the 1880s and 1890s. Americans did not have secret ballot elections until the end of the 19th century. Instead, you had you had ballot boxes, but you would go to a political meeting and they would give you a slip, and it would have a list of all that party's candidates. And so you would vote for all the candidates at once. Democrats was it red, is that right? Or are they blue? I forget. Blue. Are they blue? They would usually have blue slips, and Republicans typically had red slips. And they would use this as a way, again, as a commanding people's attention. Well, I'm going to vote blue, or I'm going to vote red. And you would go to the ballot box, everybody would see how you're voting, and you would plop it in. Leisure time sports develops at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Here again was something that was a new way of associating. And that's just one example of a myriad forms of new ways in which Americans associated with each other in this period of time, they also competed to gain our identity. And by the middle of the 20th century, people were identifying with a sports team. So I'm a Falcons fan, or I'm a Redskins fan, I'm a Packers fan, and so on and so forth. All of these, I would argue, are examples of communication innovation. They're not necessarily producing something new. They are ways in which people are able to communicate and then bring a sense of order to their lives. And while destabilizing to some traditions and habits, these things confirmed, entrenched, and furthered the decentralized nature of American society. It seems almost impossible to get rid of these things today. Another example I love to use, I may say it again later, those of you who went through a public school, you can probably remember your days in high school and junior high, and there were distinct groups of people in your school. There might have been athletes, there might have been band people, there might have been choral people, there might have been really weird people, and there might have been people who wanted to be different, and of course those people all looked the same. There might have been hippie people, there might have been working class people. In other words, there were these very distinct groups. Those are reflections of the federal nature of American society. And as high school students, as young Americans, you had to learn to navigate those different groups. Even if you went to a school in which everyone wore uniforms, or school leaders did everything they could to stamp out these different niche groups, they couldn't do it. They couldn't get rid of them, could they? They could never. People were still going to think of themselves in these different terms. That is amazing. Even in American prisons today, once prisoners come into that system, they are funneled into different groups. So I just think I think that's incredible. And I won't dwell upon it anymore. But let me move on to the second point here is, and those were positive things that I've just described. But progressive reformers at the turn of the 20th century were not too pleased with the things that they saw. They saw what they considered to be market failures. And there were things that would alarm us. They saw widespread poverty in American cities. They saw problems of assimilation of American immigrants in those cities. They saw, in some cases, poor factory conditions. In other cases, they saw poor health conditions and sanitary conditions. American cities didn't just stink, they stank. They saw a lot of things that really alarmed them. Now, they may not have saw the alternatives to these things. They may not have saw that American children were probably safer in factories than they were on traditional American farms. They probably did not see that employees working for factories had cushions against unemployment, famine, and disease that people in the countryside did not enjoy. If you have a famine in one part of the United States, there's going to be a lot of problems with American farmers in those areas because they're not going to be able to maintain their nutritional intake. In other words, a lot of what they deemed to be market failures were probably just not market failures. It's simply because they didn't understand alternative, the what-ifs. Also, a lot of what they considered to be market failures were simply a reflection of the decentralized nature of American society. They didn't like mutual aid societies. They did not like it when Americans bandied together and created different ways of ensuring their lives or their homes. They didn't like it when people voluntarily got together and created a private fire brigade. Because if someone's house caught on fire at the same time your house fire was being extinguished, and you had not paid that fire brigade to your annual membership fee, they're going to go and put out the other house's fire because those people had paid that membership fee. So progressives didn't like this sort of thing, even though I believe they are incredible examples of how human beings came together, fostered trust, fostered exchange, and fostered mutual benefits. Instead, reformers at the turn of the 20th century believed America needed to be united, and they instituted a series of reforms that we commonly associate with that progressive era that have had profound impacts upon American society. Now let me look at some of these very carefully. First and foremost, what progressive era reformers were afraid of is what Joseph Schumpeter, the great economist of the early 20th century, wrote about as creative destruction. Progressives did not understand that. They did not want Americans to fail, and they did not want Americans to waste. They saw a decentralized society and considered it wasteful. They saw, for example, different sporting teams forming different leagues and competing with each other within those different leagues, and they thought this was wasteful. Why don't we just have one national league and we can all compete with each other? So we go, the National Football League would be an example of that, though that came around later in the 20th century. Major League Baseball might be a better example of it. Basketball, in some ways, is an example of this. Basketball is an American-created sport, and do you know the history of it?
With the peach basket and what?
Well, what happened is that some athletic coaches, I think Napier was the guy's name, the main one, were disgruntled that those playing football in the wintertime and those playing baseball in the springtime had too much free time the rest of the year. And so they needed another sport to occupy their free time. They invented basketball as a result of that. So you'll never forget this, will you? Well, let's look quickly here at four main things the progressives did, all of which they did to try and emphasize and implement their control. First was political reform. Progressives insisted that the way of taming the tiger of American capitalism and the social ills of that society was through politics. And so they instituted wide-scale reforms at the local, state, and national level to try and temper what they consider to be extremes of capitalism. These kinds of things are very familiar to us if we've just had a basic American history class. The Meat Inspection Act, the Interstate Commerce Act, the Food and Drug Act. We can give you plenty of examples of this. But again, these are mainly political reforms. But outside of the realm of politics, progressives also instituted reforms within American businesses. So the development of what we call today the managerial revolution. And that is the transfer of management of a company from the owners of that company to managers of the company is something that took place at the end of the 19th into the early 20th century. Universities and colleges got on the bandwagon of this, and they created schools of scientific management, which later came on to be schools of business management, now just schools of business. But progressives like Frederick Taylor, who developed these kinds of managerial operations, believed that workers were just too wasteful. Workers were doing too many crazy things during the day. In other words, too much was distracting American workers. They were too easily distracted. Because that's how Americans had lived up to that point, constantly being distracted by these different associations pulling on their allegiance. So the way we handle this is we get everybody in one spot, we put them at a desk, we remove the distractions, we make sure they work certain hours during the day with little time to be thinking about something else. We monitor even their movements. Are workers on the assembly line moving their arms and hands in the right way to be most productive? So political reform, managerial reform. A third would be economic reform, the most important being the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And I'll just leave it at that. I won't talk anymore about the Federal Reserve System. But there's a fourth reform, a fourth effort of control that progressives instituted that I think should be discussed. And that was what we might call information reform. Now remember, I have, in case you've already forgotten, a few minutes ago I argued that the United States experienced what kind of revolution? Not an industrial revolution. Communication revolution. Like, that means that's information, an information revolution. Progressives insisted on controlling that tide of information. This was the hallmark of American progressivism then, and it remains the hallmark of American progressivism today. Control of information. The way they did it then was the creation of professional associations. This seemed to fit into the decentralized nature of American society. New associations being created. So doctors could come together and work and live and practice within the American Medical Association. Economists, which were a new discipline in American colleges and universities, could come together and further their careers and discipline through the American Economics Association. Historians could form the American Historical Association, the American Psychological Association, the Modern Languages Association, nursing associations, accounting associations, engineering associations. I could go on and on and on with lists of new groups and associations that were formed to further a particular discipline. But what you need to understand is that the purpose for these associations was to control the flow of information. Only certain kind of information would be deemed respectable within that discipline. So if you believe that you could use sound waves to treat human disease by taking those sound waves and changing the pitch and resonance, right? Resonance of those sound waves in such a way to vibrate disease cells and destroy them, you must be a quack. Because we all know the respectable way of treating disease is by injecting the body with chemicals. American Medical Association. If you're an economist, you must be critical of capitalism. Otherwise, you're not going to get a job in this profession. Because the reason the profession exists, said early American economists, was to tame capitalism, was to make it more humane. All of these efforts at control probably had one thing in common, and that was an effort to eliminate the possibility of failure. So Americans grew less and less accustomed to failure. Unless you were an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs understood failure. They endured failure. And as I mentioned yesterday, almost all the great entrepreneurs in American history failed at some point in their lives, and then they went on to do great things. But that's not possible for progressivism. And so progressives start mimicking, if not copying, the same kinds of things that American Whigs did in the 1830s and the 1840s. And example after example of political entrepreneurship, to use Bert Folsom's phrase, examples after examples of partnering with businessmen in various political and business activities, such that the cost of business risk, of entrepreneurial risk, was passed on to taxpayers and the rest of society. And just as was the case in the 1830s and the 1840s, during early 20th century progressivism, these examples of political entrepreneurship almost always failed. Whether it was a new highway or whether it was some new kind of business practice, they typically failed. Or more importantly, if it was a new kind of government program that partnered government agencies with businessmen, those things typically failed. But there's a key difference between progressive America and antebellum America. The Whigs vanished. They were blamed for the failures, and Americans rejected that approach uniformly across the United States. And by the 1850s, you don't have those kinds of activities in large numbers. Progressivism fails, but it sticks around. Americans keep it. They don't vote these people out of office. Instead, they continue to expand their political horizon. Why is that? Why is it that Americans reject these kinds of things in one century, but they embrace these kinds of things in another century? I think there are a lot of reasons for this, lots of reasons. One could just be the way the progressives rig the political system. One could be the two-party system and how it helps rig the political system. One could be war, World War I, World War II, the Cold War. The United States has been in a perpetual state of war since the 19-teens, with very few years of relief. You got to let that stick in here just a little bit and consider that, how the United States has essentially endured a second 100 Years' War that we've been a part of. Okay. Pretty profound. Well, I think there are some, perhaps some more important reasons as well. I want to talk about these two in light of Michelle Obama's comment. Human rights and human rights that are universal. And we'll finish this up. The progressives supervise an ideological change in American society. And they did so by reshaping the way Americans measure human worth and dignity. For progressives, politics is the source of a person's humanity. Now, we actually have a tradition in the Western civilization that dates back to at least the ancient Greeks that championed this idea. But most Americans have rejected that tradition, certainly by the time of the War of Independence. But by the early 20th century, progressives are reclaiming this notion that the most important human activity was a political activity. And the most important institutions would be political institutions. Progressives changed the way Americans place value on human life. not only by being part of the political process, but if you existed in a group that caught positive political attention, then you gained human dignity. And to kind of summarize this is a pretty complicated thing. For progressives, a person's potential as a human being came through politics. It didn't come through religion or religious experiences. It didn't come through family life. It didn't come through capitalism and exchanging goods and services with other people. It didn't come through philosophy. It didn't come through literature or entertainment. Instead, human worth came through political channels, because for progressives, human worth was dependent upon power and the exercise of political power. Progressives believed we were humanized by being politicized. Surely you can remember that catchy little phrase. We're humanized by being politicized. We are humanized by being regulated by the political sphere of life. And so as you can see, what progressives were doing was trying to make the political sphere of life a supreme sphere of life. They are arguing that we have to have one institution that has true authority and supremacy over our life, and that institution is going to be government. Government and government alone is the supreme authority. So no longer would Americans have to wonder, what's really going to control my life today? What's really going to command my allegiance today? It's going to be the government. Now, this was a very difficult task for progressives to achieve. After all, Americans were not just going to go along with this after having spent 3 centuries in another way of thinking. So progressives are going to use nationalism and nationalist propaganda to further this. They create more patriotic holidays. They create Flag Day. They maintain a perpetual state of war in an effort to make sure Americans were gaining their attention. Progressives, if you'll understand this, for progressives then, they will automatically assume government regulation of a problem, government regulation of a business, government regulation of an activity they deem ill. It will always be better. Why? Because it's humanizing. Again, for them, human worth and dignity only comes through politics. So the only way of correcting a market failure or correcting a problem with capitalism is through government regulation. It has nothing to do, ladies and gentlemen, with whether that regulation works. It's all about bringing something under the sphere of political activity. Results are not important. It's the fact that it's being regulated that is important, because for them, to be regulated by politics means to be humanized. To be touched by government means you are empowered and you are more fully human. It doesn't matter if it works. It doesn't matter if regulators automatically and inevitably become pawns of the industry they regulate. What matters most are the intentions and the act of bringing something under the umbrella of politics. And this, I think, comes to a third result of American progressivism, and that emphasis on universality. All human activity and all human beings must come inside the operation of the unitary state. Now, no doubt this creates lots of problems. No doubt it breeds inefficiency. No doubt corruption is present. No doubt people misuse the system. No doubt people will become apathetic. No doubt people will question this. But the most important thing for progressives and progressive intellectuals is that anyone who challenged this process of politicizing all human activity in the United States should be placed outside of politics themselves. And if you're placed outside of politics, in their mind, you're dehumanized. So those who challenge it are the ones who deserve to be outside of it. And if you're outside of it, you inevitably, in their eyes, have less human dignity and less human worth. You can imagine where this goes. In progressive era America, it went down the path of eugenics. It went down the path of fairly vicious birth controls efforts. If you were poor and you had no hope of being engaged in the political system, the best way of dealing with your poverty was to simply eliminate your ability to breed. And people who are not born are not capable of being politically engaged, and therefore they are not human. They're not human. They can't be human because they can't exercise power. Only until a child is born, through its screams and tantrums, can it actually exercise any power or influence over another human being. So for them, life must begin at the delivery of that child. It must begin there. And that's irrespective of what your views on that issue might be. Ideology for the progressives is supreme. There are no questions. There are only answers. And they have them. And they make sure they maintain those answers through, again, as I said, professional associations. Now here's what happens. Let me start wrapping this up very quickly. Progressives were not successful at squaring, I like that phrase here, squaring American social life. Remember I said, let's think of a picture of an individual in the middle surrounded by countless overlapping spheres of activity. They want to square that. Make it more simple. Make it rigid. Somebody's at the top, somebody's at the bottom. So it's also a hierarchical system. They weren't able to do this. Even in their efforts of controlling American education, have largely failed. American public schools have probably done a lot of good things. I'm not denying that. But in terms of what progressives wanted most out of American public education, it has not achieved what they wanted. It has not unified Americans. And you are a testimony to this in how you experienced high school life, those different groups that you went through. Another major challenge for progressivism, and this is something I'm only beginning to work on, is self-expression is increasingly becoming a measure of human goodness. And this is a reflection of their efforts to politicize everything. How do we maintain human dignity and worth? You exercise power. You're engaged in the political system. You make a political difference. But new technologies are allowing people to express themselves in such a way they can impact the political system while being outside of that political system. Those of us who are older can remember the importance of bumper stickers. Y'all know what bumper stickers are? One of the most popular radio talk show hosts in American history, Paul Harvey, would always close some of his segments with bumper Snickers, he called them. Today's bumper sticker was, and they would read off somebody saying this crazy bumper sticker. It's a form of self-expression. And of course, you are most familiar with blogging, with Facebook, with other kinds of posting your outrage and your 2-minute hate about some event that you have encountered today. Whew, you got that out of your system. You see, ladies and gentlemen, civic engagement today is increasingly outside of politics. And that element, that central tenet of progressivism is collapsing. And so, more and more, our humanity is being drawn from our self-expression, not from our connection to the political system. And progressives are pretty upset with this. And I think there's two sort of scenarios where we're going, and I'm ending here. One could be the collapse of progressivism as we know it. That as an ideology, it's simply turning against itself. We politicize everything, but now we politicize everything through blogging, through Facebook, through Vine, through Reddit, and all Imager, and help me, what are some other things?
Twitter, Facebook.
Twitter, oh yeah, I said Facebook. I got Facebook, dude. Twitter, and countless other new technologies. Again, these are communication technologies, by the way. And so, everybody can now be a politician. And when everybody can be a politician, politicians aren't important. And I think this is something of a long-term running pattern. One way Americans are dealing with the decentralized society in which we're in, this is strictly true for young people, is that you spot someone that you think has figured out how to navigate these spheres and properly order their lives, and then you imitate them. This is what the term celebrity means. We spot a celebrity, we think they've got it, and we start being like that celebrity. And when I was growing up, I remember a lot of young girls thinking Madonna had figured out this, the key way of dealing with life, and so they'd come to school dressed like Madonna. That's actually an attack upon progressivism. That's something that strikes at the heart of progressive ideology, because it's something that's beyond their control. It could also be that we are reaching a point of a sort of a Hayekian climax, a point in which central planners now have the computing capacity to know all the decisions that drive economic exchange, have social networking sites, self-promotional sites, collection of student learning data, and the use of consumer buying information, giving us enough knowledge to know what people want before they actually want it, gives us the ability to produce those things, steer consumer subjective tastes, and thus centrally plan an economy. At times, Friedrich Hayek himself said if you could do that, if you had the technology to know it all, the answer would be yes. In about 5 years, this cell phone, or one like it, will have the same computing capacity as the human brain. Within 30 years, it will have the same computing capacity as St. Louis. All the brains in St. Louis. That's freaky. And will this amount of power, the amount of power and the amount of knowledge needed to know these market things and subjective tastes, will they be used for political purposes? And the power to use these things for political purposes will always be used to otherwise rig the political system. So I think it's inevitable that central planners will use this knowledge to shape consumer behavior around the taste of the planners. And in doing so, they will continue to upset the fragile signals that entrepreneurs need and businesses need for their production, And so as they exercise the power to shape our taste, they're going to create the same false signals that really central banking does. And so we're going to have the same business cycles, but rather being based on monetary conditions, it might be based on their misappropriation of consumer tastes. It will steer people in a direction in which they really don't want. Parallel societies, ladies and gentlemen, still exist and flourish in the United States. They are different than before, but they are flourishing things nonetheless. A critical difference from today to 150 years ago is that the unwritten constitution of American social life can now be put down on paper. These things are no longer ephemeral. We now can see our social networks by turning on a computer screen. We instinctively knew what those networks were, but now others will know what those networks are. What will happen when the constellations of our souls becomes a printed page or leaves a real footprint that we can see and manipulate and change? Will we harness these things for political purposes? I think so, and I think it's going to be incredibly dangerous. So now more than at any other time in our history, the very thing that makes us Americans, it's not our ideology, it's not ideas, it's not tradition, it's not where we are from, but it's how we live our lives on a daily basis, could be threatened. And that future may be bleak unless we continue to push the boundaries of these associations. The way to combat this is to expand our social networks, is to create more associations, is to create more relationships. It's not to withdraw and isolate ourselves and lose those things that make our lives worth living. It's to embrace them and to further them. So, you need to go out and make friends. You need to get married. You need to have children. You need to have a bunch of them. You need to buy things. You need to taste new donuts. You need to learn to make good coffee. You need to sell the things that you are good at. But don't post about this on Facebook. Thank you.